Welcome to Discovering with Dr. Deb. Our last season, we were discovering the Enneagram with Dr. Deb, and it was packed with a lot of information while also being a lot of fun to talk about and explore the Enneagram and why we do what we do. So go back and check out those episodes if you haven't seen them already. Here we are in season 2, and I'm going to be focusing on trauma and using EMDR therapy as a tool to help process trauma. My co-host for this season is psychologist Dr. Christie Sprowls from Austin, Texas. She has traveled all over the world to provide EMDR in humanitarian efforts, and she has also trained clinicians and providers in EMDR therapy. So get ready, let's dive right in and talk about trauma. Hello, and welcome to this episode. We are going to be talking today with Dr. Christie Sprowls, and we're going to look a little bit at treating depression by using EMDR. And I know that there's not a lot of studies out that show EMDR is a treatment for depression that really targets depression itself. But really what they're showing is there is some improvement in symptoms when they are targeting what led to the depression, things that triggered the depression, maybe experiences or things like that. And one thing you've said before in other episodes too is that's really what we do with EMDR. Okay. We kind of go back and we look at when did they first notice those symptoms, what was going on at the time. We look at the first time they noticed it, the worst time they noticed it, and then the most recent. So really we wouldn't do that any differently when we were working with somebody who has depressive symptoms.
That's right. That's exactly right.
So I know a lot of times too, and I in private practice world, we have a lot of people that come in with depression, present with depression. And a lot of the times they'll notice, maybe it happened when their parents got divorced, or they noticed when they had to move or things like that. And I really reframe it for clients. I'll call that kind of like, let's call that unresolved grief instead of depression. Maybe that was grief. And I know we do EMDR in grief work also, because it's easy to kind of identify something that we lost. But that's often too what happened for somebody with depression. It never was processed. And a lot of times too, when it's a childhood experience, it's just not validated. So sometimes, friends move, and that's what, the child gets told, friends move, we lose our pets, grandparents were old, and it's kind of minimized. But it may have been a real important person in their life, or somebody they had a lot of support and encouragement from. And so, if they present with depressive symptoms, I think it's important to kind of go back and do that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. You want to know what was the onset, and were there any precipitating events? So that's really what we focus on when we're doing EMDR with somebody who comes in and presents with depression. What can we do for them? What might have gotten installed in the brain? What kind of processes might we undo to get them beyond that depression? Now, just like any other thing, like with OCD, there are going to be some people who are going to require medication and response prevention and EMDR for the rest of their lives, because it is a genetic component.
Right.
And there's nothing that we can do about genetics. We can't.
That's right. We cannot do anything about genetics. We can't
alter genetics. So, but we can make it something that's more tolerable. And that could be a combination of medicine and EMDR, right on anything in their past. And when I have done it from that perspective, on depression, I've had some extremely wonderful results. People saying things like, "Oh my gosh, I had one person, it took me 2 years to convince her." We just were doing talk therapy.
Right.
2 years to convince her to do EMDR, and 2 years to convince her to get on medication. And she came in after getting on medication, and we started doing some EMDR. And she said, "Why didn't I do this
sooner?" Exactly.
Because
I've heard that.
It remitted. She was able to not have depression for the first time, and really in her life. And hers began young, after her parents' divorce. They were both doctors, by the way. And anyway, it was not an easy divorce, and it's a contentious relationship to this day, so it makes it hard on her. But it did help. But I do know of some cases, not my own, that have not remitted with any. I'm not sure they had ever had EMDR. As a matter of fact, I know they did not have EMDR, but nothing was touching it.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm real interested in that, actually, like how in the world, wonder if there's something we could do with them with EMDR.
Mm-hmm.
It would be something worth doing.
Yeah.
Just to see, wow, maybe we could budge this,
right.
Just a little bit.
Right.
But we are working on what is in the past is disturbing, and what, like you said, grief in particular. What
that's just the framework I see everything through, just with my history and my training and everything. I just look at so much that comes in as there's so much unresolved. And I do a grief timeline with almost all my clients and look at losses that they've had. Mm-hmm. And sometimes they're just things that once they start a timeline, and I usually have them do that as homework so that they can really spend some time on it and let themselves kind of be vulnerable without being under the microscope like they might feel, in the office.
Yes.
And so they will often say, oh my gosh, this happened and I totally had forgotten about that. Things will come to mind when they're doing a grief timeline. And then even, one of the things we do with EMDR is helping them to identify this negative cognition with those memories. And I will even have them do that. And so that's what I think lends itself to the depressive symptoms, the low self-esteem, the depressed mood, the lack of motivation, lack of energy, change in sleep, change in, eating habits and all of that kind of stuff. It's like, it seems like that. And then sometimes it's compounded, things have happened and then more things have happened and just kind of piled up and they're under this mountain of, unresolved grief.
Yes.
And then it looks a lot like depression, and it is. And I, one of the things I try, a lot of times I think people are diagnosed with depression when it's unresolved grief because they don't know to kind of explore that.
Mm-hmm. I couldn't agree with you more.
Yeah.
I feel like there was a study Elizabeth Kubler-Ross did, and I'm sure you, of course, know who she is, and all therapists pretty much, but I really liked it. It was a special on PBS where she was talking about grief and how we as a society are not handling it very well. And I know we're going to be talking about grief in our next episode, so I won't go too much into it, but it is something that's cumulative, just like anything else that starts to pile on. And just getting it off of our nervous system, getting it off with EMDR, focusing on what is, what's got its hooks into you and how it's keeping you down.
Well, and a lot of children and adolescents, they deny having any reaction or thought or feeling to things that happen in their world. So, for example, parents' divorce. They feel, especially if one parent is unhappy about it, or if it's contentious, like they don't want to contribute. They don't want to add to the problem in the household. And so they're going to act like I'm fine. Everything's fine. And they don't talk about it. And my doctoral dissertation was adolescent grief. And that's another thing too with grief. If there's been a death of a parent, say, like they don't want to add to the surviving parent's loss. And so they're going to be fine. That's what they're going to present with. And so it's just not ever dealt with. All of this lately with, the royal family, they talked about, when Princess Diana died and the boys just had to have this stiff upper. Like, well, that's what we do in this country. Like we're very death denying and grief denying as a culture. So we don't address it. We don't deal with it. And then it just gets compounded. Like you didn't make it onto the, football team or the cheer squad.
Yes.
Exactly. And so that's a loss. You don't get into the college you wanted to go to. And then even you look at our senior year, kids celebrate, this is my senior year. And it's really bittersweet because it's the last time they're doing these things. So they're grieving while they're celebrating. And it's important to hold space for both.
Yes.
And not just them, for parents also, and I remember saying, I won't be one of those parents when my kids are grown and gone, empty nesters. We're going to do all this stuff. It was terrible. It was terrible.
It is terrible.
And I just didn't even until it slapped me in the face,
Yes.
But that again is just unidentified, unresolved grief, which really can lend itself to depression and looks a lot like depression.
That's right.
So when you go back and you talk about the first time you noticed it, the worst time, and the most recent, and there's depression. Like you said, a lot of times there is a physiological thing or a genetic, predisposition. But I think too, oftentimes with depression, it's not unlike unresolved grief.
I do too. I think they're very tied together. And going back to the canary that we were talking about, the little bird that died, right? That something people hanging on to, and rightfully so. It's not like this is, again, it's not pathology. It is just that symbol, death, grief. How do we deal with it? How do you talk about it? How do you, how do we deal with the depression that comes from that? How do you deal with living with a parent who has depression? So much going on in the home that can contribute. And just like anxiety, depression also, this is a crazy study that I had heard about, that it shows that the fetus inside of a woman, right? And subsequently a baby, can feel the depression of the
mother. Oh, the father. Oh, I hadn't heard that one.
I know. You could feel, this one was kind of like cuckoo, right? That they can feel it from the mom. Well, but that's okay.
That makes sense.
That's where you live. You pick up on it. And the father. And so I'm just thinking, how much do we pick up from the environment?
Right.
How much do we pick up from our parents? How much do we,
right.
And we were talking about this earlier, the pandemic and the implications for physicians. And then you start talking about teenagers again. And, they were the population, one of the populations that were hardest hit also.
Absolutely.
And gosh, life is changing at such a young age.
Yes.
Anyway.
Yes. And you look at even adults, in my generation, we're now called the sandwich generation because so many are caring for, parents and children. And so the pressures of all of that's a lot. And pressure, unaddressed is possibly could lead to depression.
Yes.
So looking at what's triggered that, like what's been going on, and then the negative cognition, like I'm not enough to handle, I can't handle it all. I can't, or I'm a failure as a child, or I'm a failure as a parent, and looking at those kinds of things too. But there's so much, I have a friend who's cared for her mom who had Alzheimer's, and still had children at home and all, it's a lot, A lot. So, and we just don't really talk about that. We don't really hold space for that. And again, we're in this, time and age where there's fluid gender identities and things like that, and parents who have children that are making choices or identifying things that are foreign to the parents, and then like where does that loss get to be voiced and shared?
Yes.
And so we see a lot of depression in those kind of situations. And again, it's unresolved grief. There's a lot of loss that's not associated with death. And we'll talk about that. We'll do a whole episode probably on grief. But I think it's just important to kind of hold space for that and validate that, But I think what I see a lot with depression, outside of the genetic stuff and them having this predisposition because of hereditary, because it is hereditary.
Yep.
A lot of the times there hasn't been a time, and a lot of times it's kind of like trauma. It gets stuck and it gets hidden, and then it doesn't ever get processed or dealt with. And so what we want to do in using EMDR with clients with depression is just allow their brain to process it in a healthy way.
That's right. Try to work with it.
Yeah.
You made me think about epigenetics. And that may be another day's conversation. I think we're at time.
Just about.
Yeah.
Just about. Anything else you want to say about depression before we close this one?
Well, just that it can get expressed.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
That like things in the stressors in the world can express it, meaning that the cells change and then the forward motion of developing depression and shutting down different parts of the brain and hippocampus and all that good stuff.
Oh, that's all that smart stuff. That's above my pay grade.
Well, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, no, I don't mean that.
But it is. It's okay.
It's above mine.
It's okay. It's above yours too. Yeah. Hippocampus, amygdala. Oh my goodness, all that stuff. Yeah.
Lots to know.
Lots to know.
That's why it takes you 5 years to become a psychologist a neuropsychologist. 5 years after you got your doctorate.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. They're smart.
And they are. They are. All right. Well, that's enough for today. We're hoping you learned something about using EMDR, about maybe depression or unresolved grief or any of the above.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
So I hope you enjoyed it, and we'll see you next episode. If this content has been helpful to you, I'd appreciate it if you would please rate the podcast, post it, and share it on social media. And also post a review. If you'd like to get in contact with me, my phone is 479-561-7600, or email Dr. Deborah at anchoredhopecounseling.net or Dr. Deborah at drdebfordoctors.com. Our website at www.anchoredhopecounseling.net has some useful information, and you can also reach out to me through the website. Remember, you are enough just the way you are, and you are loved.